broken engine, a billionaire in crisis, and a janitor holding a mop in the corner, the only person in the room who knew exactly what was wrong. Nobody asked him. Nobody looked at him. He was invisible, the way people like him always are in rooms like that one. But when every expert failed and the clock ran out, Scarlett Vale did something she'd never done before in her life. She listened to the man pushing the mop. What happened next changed everything, for both of them. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, and by 9 o'clock it wasn't rain anymore. It was punishment. It came down in thick, angry sheets against the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of Blackwood Prestige Motors, drumming so hard on the roof that mechanics inside had to raise their voices just to argue with each other. And there was plenty of arguing to go around. The dealership sat at the northern edge of Meridian City's financial district, a sleek 2-story building of glass and brushed steel that looked more like a museum than a place where cars were sold and serviced. On any other night, the showroom floor glittered under soft gallery lighting, Ferraris and Aston Martins and custom-built machines that most people would never touch in their lifetimes, arranged like sculptures, roped off and spotlit and gorgeous. On any other night, the place breathed a particular kind of quiet wealth, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Tonight, the showroom was dark. All the light, all the noise, all the energy had collapsed into the service garage at the back of the building where 14 people stood around a single car and nobody had a single useful thing to say. The car was a 2019 Vortex Meridian RS7, one of only 11 ever manufactured, finished in a shade of burnt orange that the factory called Ember Sovereign and that collectors called priceless. The RS7 had a mid-mounted 4.8-liter flat-six engine that produced sounds ordinary engines had no business making, and its owner, a 73-year-old collector named Reginald Ashford III, had paid $3.4 million for it 4 years ago. He'd driven it a total of 612 miles. He kept it in a climate-controlled private garage. He had it transported by enclosed trailer everywhere it needed to go. He was, in Reginald Ashford's own careful words, not the kind of man who tolerated problems. The car had arrived at Blackwood 3 days ago for its annual maintenance service, a routine inspection, fluids, a calibration check on the onboard systems. Nothing complicated. Nothing that should have caused the slightest concern. But somewhere in the process, something had gone wrong. Nobody could agree on what exactly. The engine had started stuttering during a diagnostic cycle, then caught an error code nobody recognized, then thrown 2 more. And by yesterday afternoon, the RS7 simply refused to start at all. The Reginald Ashford Invitational Automotive Exhibition was in 41 hours. Ashford expected his car to be there. Scarlett Vale stood at the front of the circle of mechanics, with her arms crossed and her jaw tight enough to crack something. She was 30 years old and had been running Blackwood Prestige Motors for 6 years, inheriting it from her father at 24 when he'd had his first heart attack and deciding quite firmly that she would not let it fail. She hadn't. Under her management, the dealership had tripled its revenue, expanded into restoration services, and built a reputation that stretched well beyond Meridian City. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt that had been crisped this morning and was now slightly wrinkled, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she'd stopped caring about it hours ago. She was not a woman who panicked. She was very close to panicking. "Talk to me," she said to the man standing nearest the engine bay. "What are we looking at?" Marcus Webb was 48 years old and had been the dealership's head of restoration services for 11 years. He had thick forearms and gray temples, and the specific confidence of a man who had been the smartest person in most rooms he'd entered for most of his adult life. He was looking at the RS7's open engine bay with an expression that Scarlett had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who genuinely did not know. "We've run 3 full diagnostic cycles," Marcus said. "The error codes are coming back inconsistent, different fault flags each time. I've pulled the wiring harness, checked the fuel injectors, tested the ECU twice. Nothing's showing obvious damage. Nothing looks like it should be causing a no start." "But the car isn't starting," Scarlett said. "Correct. And we have 41 hours. 40, someone said from the back. 40 hours, Scarlett repeated. And the best answer we have is nothing looks like it should be causing a no start. Marcus pressed his lips together. He'd stopped defending himself an hour ago. To his right, a younger mechanic named Devin Park shifted his weight from foot to foot. Devin was 26, trained at a specialty performance center in Stuttgart, and had been brought in specifically to handle exotic vehicles. He'd never failed to diagnose a problem in under 3 hours. He'd been staring at this engine for 6. "The symptoms suggest a heat-related fault," he said carefully. "Something that only manifests under load or at temperature. But we can't replicate the conditions without running the engine, and we can't run the engine because it won't start," Scarlett finished. "Yes." She turned and walked 10 feet away from the group, which was the closest thing she permitted herself to showing frustration in front of her staff. She stood with her back to them, looking through the rain-blurred glass at the empty parking lot, and she breathed slowly and thought about Reginald Ashford III and the phone call she would have to make, and what it would mean for Blackwood's relationship with every collector in his circle, which was an extensive and influential circle. And she understood with absolute clarity that this was the kind of problem that didn't stay contained. Reputation in this industry moved faster than money. She turned back around. "Who else can we call?" "I already called everyone I know," Marcus said. "DiPietro from the Vortex Service Center in Chicago said he could maybe get here by tomorrow night. Maybe. Ferrari's technical consultant is in Geneva. There's a guy in Los Angeles who's worked on RS7s before, but he wants $20,000 up front just to get on a plane." "Call him." "Already did. His assistant said he's in the middle of a restoration job he won't leave." A silence settled over the garage that had a particular quality to it. The silence of intelligent people who had run out of ideas and didn't want to say so out loud. The rain kept coming. In the far back corner of the garage, past the tool storage and the parts shelves and the second lift that hadn't been used in 3 weeks, a man pushed a mop in slow, patient circles across the concrete floor. Ethan Cole was 32 years old, and he moved through the dealership's back spaces the way a person moves through a place they've learned to be invisible in. Quietly, efficiently, never in anyone's way. He was lean and a little worn-looking, with dark circles under his eyes that had nothing to do with tonight specifically and everything to do with the last 4 years in general. He wore gray coveralls with a small Blackwood patch on the chest that identified him as part of the overnight cleaning crew. He had a face that might have been called handsome if he ever slept properly or ate a real breakfast. Strong jaw and steady dark eyes and hands that looked too rough and capable for the job he was doing. He was 20 feet from the circle of mechanics. He had been listening for the past hour. He wasn't trying to listen. He wasn't the kind of person who inserted himself into situations. But the garage acoustics were what they were, and voices carried, and Ethan had very good ears, trained ears. Ears that had spent years learning to hear things in engines that other people couldn't hear. So even while he worked, even while his hands pushed the mop handle back and forth in an automatic rhythm, his body had long since memorized. The part of his brain that used to belong to a different version of himself had been processing every word the mechanic said. He kept moving the mop. The different version of himself felt a long time ago tonight. Ethan had grown up in the same neighborhood his father had grown up in. A working-class section of Meridian City's east side where the storefronts were practical and nobody decorated for aesthetics. His father had run a small auto repair shop on Garfield Avenue for 30 years. Nothing glamorous, nothing exotic, just the steady, unglamorous work of keeping ordinary people's ordinary vehicles running. Ethan had spent his childhood in that shop. He'd held flashlights before he could reach the hood of a car. He'd changed oil by the time he was 12. By 15, he could diagnose most common mechanical problems by sound alone, a skill his father called having an ear for it, and that his high school teachers, who wanted him to think about college, called a waste of his potential. He'd gone to college anyway. 2 years of engineering, enough to understand the physics of what he'd always done intuitively. Then he'd transferred to a specialty automotive program and spent 3 years training on European performance vehicles, Porsches, Lamborghinis, the occasional Vortex when they could get access to one. He'd been good, genuinely good. Not good the way some people are good, with enough training and dedication and the right certifications. Good. The way some people are good when a thing fits the exact shape of their mind. He'd worked at a performance shop in the financial district for 2 years after that. He'd been 25, making decent money, starting to build a name. Then his wife Claire got sick. He didn't think about that part on most nights. He'd learned over the years which things to let himself think about and which ones he kept sealed up, because you couldn't function if you were always carrying everything. Claire had been 26 when the diagnosis came, and 28 when she died. And in between those two ages, Ethan had spent every penny they'd saved, and a fair amount they hadn't, and he'd rearranged every other priority in his life around her care and around their son, who had been born 8 months before the first symptoms appeared. His name was Noah. He was 4 years old now. He had Claire's eyes and Ethan's ears and a laugh that was so loud and sudden it could startle you every time, no matter how many times you'd heard it. After Claire died, Ethan hadn't gone back to the performance shop. He told himself it was temporary. He needed something that let him be home in the mornings for Noah, something that didn't require him to be fully present in ways he wasn't capable of being, not yet. He'd found the overnight cleaning position at Blackwood through a temp agency. The hours were 11 to 7, which let him drop Noah at his neighbor Mrs. Ferrar's in the evening and be back before she needed to leave for her own job. It paid a little over minimum wage after taxes. He'd meant to stay 3 months. It had been 14. He kept telling himself he was almost ready to go back, to dust off his certifications and call the shop contacts he still had, and step back into the version of himself that knew what he was doing. But then there was always something, a bill that came in higher than expected, or Noah had a bad week and needed more of him, or Ethan would sit down at the kitchen table after Noah was asleep and feel so tired that the distance between where he was and where he'd been felt too long to travel tonight. He'd get there eventually. He just needed a little more time. In the garage, someone said something that made the group of mechanics laugh. A short, dismissive sound with an edge to it. Ethan kept mopping. But he'd heard something 20 minutes ago that had lodged itself in the specific part of his brain that didn't really have an off switch. He hadn't meant to hear it. He hadn't gone looking for it. But Devon Park had described the engine's behavior during the last attempted start. The hesitation, the specific kind of crank cycle, the way it caught for half a second and then died. And the way he'd described it had landed in Ethan's ear like a puzzle piece connecting to something he'd read 5 years ago. Not read. Studied. Stayed up until 3 in the morning studying because he'd had a car with similar symptoms once and never entirely understood why his repair had worked. He stopped mopping. He stood still for a moment, looking at the floor. Then he looked at the group of mechanics around the orange car. He knew exactly what it was. He was almost certain. Not completely certain, but certain enough that the thing he recognized as intellectual honesty was having trouble letting him keep mopping. He went back to mopping. It's not your business, he thought. You're here to clean. He made it another 40 seconds. Oh, excuse me? The words came out quieter than he'd intended. Nobody turned around. The mechanics were in the middle of a debate about whether to attempt another diagnostic cycle or whether to disassemble the intake and inspect it physically, and neither side was particularly interested in being interrupted. Ethan cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said again, louder. Marcus Webb turned first, with the slow, unimpressed turn of a man interrupted in the middle of thinking. He looked at Ethan the way you look at something you're surprised to see standing upright. His gaze moved from Ethan's face to the patch on his coveralls to the mop in his hand, and somewhere in that 3-second inventory the shape of his expression settled into something polite and patient and faintly dismissive. "Yeah?" Marcus said. Sorry." Ethan's jaw was tight. He'd been in enough situations in his life to recognize the particular kind of exposure that came from speaking in rooms where you weren't expected to speak, and it never got comfortable. "I heard you describing the symptoms, the way it cranked and caught and died, the inconsistent error codes." Devon Park had turned around now. So had 2 of the other mechanics. They were looking at him with variations of the same expression Marcus had, polite, patient, and already discounting whatever was about to happen. "I think it might be a thermal crack in the intake runner," Ethan said. "Specifically, the secondary intake, not the main. There's a design issue in early RS7 builds where the secondary intake runner has a thinner wall section near the 3rd cylinder's port. The alloy they used expands faster than the surrounding components when the engine reaches operating temperature. In factory spec, the tolerances account for it, but if there's even a hairline fracture anywhere in that section, it's invisible cold. When the engine heats up, the crack opens just enough to create a vacuum leak. Not a big one. Big enough to confuse the fuel management system and pull false readings across the whole system. Nishachment. Nobody said anything. Then Marcus said slowly, "That's a very specific diagnosis." "I know. Based on. Based on the way Devin described the crank cycle and the fact that your error codes are inconsistent. A vacuum leak from a thermal crack wouldn't throw consistent codes because the leak only exists at temperature. Every time you run the diagnostic cold, the crack's closed, the system reads clean. But the ECU logged the faults from when the engine was hot, so it's throwing those codes even though it can't find the physical cause now." Silence. Devin Park's expression had moved through dismissal and arrived somewhere more complicated. Not convinced, not yet, but not entirely closed off either. Then someone in the back said with a short, pointed laugh, "The janitor's diagnosing the engine." It wasn't said quietly. It wasn't meant to be. A couple of people smiled. Not mean smiles exactly, more the reflexive, uncomfortable kind that happen when social awkwardness presents itself and people reach for laughter to fill the space. Marcus didn't smile, but he turned back toward the engine with an air of finality that amounted to the same thing. "Appreciate the input," Marcus said. It was not an appreciative tone. Ethan's hand tightened around the mop handle. He should go back to the corner. He knew that. Nobody had asked him. Nobody was going to ask him. He'd said his piece and been politely, laughingly dismissed, and the correct response was to accept that and go back to cleaning because that was what he was here to do. He was about to do exactly that when he heard a new voice. "What did you just say, but?" Scarlett Vale had been standing at the edge of the group with her arms crossed and her expression somewhere between exhausted and calculating. She'd been only half listening to Ethan's explanation, not because she was dismissive in the way the others were, but because she'd been simultaneously running numbers in her head about the DiPietro option from Chicago and what she'd say to Ashford if it came to that. But something in the specificity of what the man in the cleaning coveralls had said had cut through the background noise of her thinking and made her pay attention. She was not, by nature, a person who trusted feelings over data. She'd built her success on exactly the opposite philosophy. But she'd also spent enough time around people to recognize the difference between someone guessing and someone who knew. The guess had a different quality to it, looser, more hedged, seeking approval. What she'd just heard wasn't that. Ethan looked at her. He recognized her immediately. The CEO, Scarlett Vale, a name and a face that everyone at Blackwood knew. He'd seen her in the building before, always moving quickly, always in the middle of something, always with the particular force field of authority around her that made people move out of her way without being asked. "The secondary intake runner," he said, slower this time, meeting her eyes. "Hairline crack, probably near the third cylinder port. It's a thermal fault. The crack seals when the metal cools, which is why the cold diagnostics aren't finding it. But when this engine ran hot, the crack opened, created a vacuum leak, and the fuel management system started receiving bad data. The ECU started compensating for a condition that kept changing, which generated inconsistent fault codes. Eventually, the compensation parameters maxed out, and the system went into protection mode and shut the engine down." Scarlett looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Marcus. "Is that possible?" Marcus's expression had shifted slightly. He was a proud man and a thorough mechanic, and something about the specificity of the diagnosis was creating uncomfortable friction with his certainty. "The RS7 intake design. Yes, there's a known thin wall section in that area. It's been documented in Vortex's internal service notes, but they never issued a recall because it only presents as a problem if there's a pre-existing fracture," Ethan said. "Yeah, and a fracture like that could come from a manufacturing variance or from a thermal stress cycle, running the engine hard and then cooling it down fast, repeatedly. At 3 million miles of—" He stopped, corrected himself. "At 4 years and 600 miles. If this car ever got pushed on a track or in a cold environment, the intake could have developed a stress fracture years ago. Too small to see. Too small to matter until the cumulative thermal cycling widened it." The garage was very quiet. The rain was still loud on the roof. Scarlett said, "How do you know about the internal service notes?" Ethan's jaw moved. "I used to work on cars like this." "Here?" "No." He said it without elaboration. Scarlett studied him the way she studied balance sheets, not looking for what she wanted to see, looking for what was actually there. There was something about the way he held his ground without performing confidence, the way he'd answered her questions without trying to impress her, that registered as genuine in a way she didn't entirely have language for. She turned back to Marcus. How long would it take to inspect the secondary intake runner physically? Marcus hesitated. We'd have to pull the intake manifold, an hour, maybe 90 minutes. Do it. Scarlett, we have 40 hours and no better ideas. She kept her voice even. If he's wrong, we've lost 90 minutes. If he's right, we've lost 90 minutes and saved the contract. She paused. Do it. Marcus looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him without flinching. Marcus turned to his team. Pull the intake manifold. The next 90 minutes were some of the longest of Ethan's professional memory, including, and this was saying something, the 2 hours he'd spent in a hospital waiting room 4 years ago while doctors told him things he didn't want to hear. He hadn't gone back to the corner. He hadn't been able to. He'd moved to the edge of the working space and stood there, mop leaning against the wall, watching the team work. A couple of the mechanics kept glancing at him with expressions ranging from skeptical to actively hoping he was wrong. Devin Park was harder to read. He worked precisely and without ego, and twice while dismantling components he paused and looked at something slightly longer than strictly necessary. And each time he did, Ethan felt the familiar pull of a shared language. Marcus worked with the focused silence of a man who had made peace with the possibility that he might have missed something. The rain outside had settled into a steady droning rhythm. At just past 11:30, Devin Park removed the secondary intake manifold, tilted it under the direct beam of a work light, and said very quietly, "Marcus?" Marcus came around the engine bay and looked. He didn't say anything for 6 seconds. "Where is it?" Scarlett asked from behind him. She'd stayed in the garage the entire time, standing against the wall with her phone in her hand and an expression that didn't change much regardless of what she was feeling. Marcus took the manifold from Devin and held it under the light at a specific angle. Then he turned and held it out toward the center of the garage without a word. Scarlett stepped forward and looked. Near the third cylinder port, where the wall of the secondary runner narrowed to its thinnest dimension, there was a crack. Not obvious. Not something you'd see at a glance or under normal workshop lighting, or when the metal was at room temperature. It was maybe 1.25 inches long and the width of a heavy thread, and it ran diagonally across the alloy, casting like a line someone had drawn there very carefully and then tried to erase. Scarlett looked at the crack for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at Ethan across the garage. He was standing against the wall, 20 feet away, with his mop beside him and his arms at his sides. He wasn't grinning. He wasn't doing the thing people do when they've been proved right, that small, involuntary performance of vindication. He looked tired and a little pale, as though being right about this had cost him something. "I need materials," he said. "High-temperature metal epoxy and a thermal sleeve for the runner. You'll also need to check the vacuum lines on the intake side. If the ECU was compensating for a variable leak, it may have over-adjusted the fuel trim. You'll need to reset the adaptation values and run a full cycle at operating temperature before you can test the start." Marcus was already moving. It was one of the stranger experiences of Ethan's recent life, being the one people were listening to. Not because it felt good exactly, that wasn't entirely the right word. It felt like putting on clothes you'd packed away years ago and discovering they still fit, which is a feeling with more edges to it than it looks like from the outside. He knew what he was doing. His hands remembered. His brain moved through the problem with a clarity and speed that nothing else in his current life allowed it to move with. And some part of him that he'd kept carefully muffled for 14 months was awake and loud tonight. He worked alongside the mechanics rather than directing them. He was careful about that. He positioned himself as a consultant rather than a supervisor, partly because it was more accurate, and partly because the room had an existing hierarchy, and blowing it up wasn't going to make the next 2 hours easier. He explained each step before executing it. When Marcus had a better approach to a specific part of the repair, Ethan said so, which seemed to surprise Marcus more than anything else had tonight. Devin Park worked close to him and asked good questions. Not defensive questions, not challenge the premise questions. Genuine, mechanically precise questions from someone who was trying to learn, and Ethan answered them the same way. Scarlett stayed in the garage. He was aware of her in the way you're aware of something that doesn't quite fit the expected pattern of a room. She didn't hover. She didn't micromanage. She stood at a slight distance and watched with the focused patience of someone who had learned to read situations rather than control them. And a few times when Ethan looked up from the engine, he caught her looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely categorize. He looked down and kept working. At one point, somewhere after midnight, Marcus handed him a tool without being asked. The specific 4mm driver Ethan had reached toward before speaking, passed over with the automatic precision of two mechanics who'd been working a problem together long enough to read each other's movements. Marcus didn't comment on it. Neither did Ethan. But something shifted slightly in the garage's air after that, the way it shifts when an unspoken argument resolves itself without anyone having to acknowledge it out loud. Around 1 a.m, Ethan worked the repaired intake manifold back into position while Devin held the alignment, and as the bolts came up to torque, he felt something in his chest that he recognized distantly as satisfaction. Raw, uncomplicated, the feeling of a thing correctly made. He reset the ECU adaptation values from the diagnostic terminal, cleared the fault codes, ran the system through a cold pretest cycle. Everything read clean. "Okay," he said. "Let's see." "But there's must." The garage got quiet the way garages get quiet before an engine turns over. A specific, held breath quality that Ethan recognized from 20 years of working in spaces like this. Marcus stood at the driver's door. Devin was at the diagnostics terminal. 3 other mechanics had arranged themselves at various observation points around the car, whether to watch for success or failure unclear. Scarlett came forward and stood at the edge of the pool of light around the RS7. Marcus reached in and turned the key. The starter engaged. The engine turned. 1 second of nothing. Ethan found that he was holding his breath and made himself stop. Then the RS7 caught. It didn't just start. It came alive. The flat 6 exhaled a sound that moved through the garage like something physical, a low, authoritative note that climbed and settled and sat there, filling the space, perfectly even, no hesitation, no flutter. The kind of sound that made you understand why people spent millions of dollars on machines like this. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Marcus reached for the diagnostic terminal and checked the readings, and his face did something complicated and private, and he said, "All parameters nominal. No fault codes. Fuel trim is holding. She's running clean." The garage didn't erupt. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter than that. The specific quiet of people absorbing something they hadn't expected to be true. A silence that had weight and texture to it. Devin Park looked at Ethan across the car. He nodded once, the specific nod that means well done in the language people who work with their hands use when they've stopped caring about anything except whether the thing works. Ethan nodded back. He turned away from the engine. His mop was still leaning against the wall where he'd left it. He walked back to it, picked it up, and looked at the floor section he hadn't finished. There was a gray smear near the parts shelf that he'd missed on his last pass. He started working on it. Behind him, he heard Scarlett's voice. "Ethan." He turned. She was standing 10 feet away, and she was looking at him the way she hadn't looked at him earlier. Not assessing, not calculating. Something more direct than that. Something that seemed to require more from her face than she was entirely comfortable with. "What's your son's name?" she said. He blinked. Of all the things he'd expected her to say, that wasn't one of them. "Noah," he said. "He's 4. She looked at him for another moment. "Go home," she said quietly. "You've been here since 11. Get some sleep before he wakes up." Ethan looked at the unfinished section of floor, then back at her. "I'll finish the—" "Leave it," she said. "Go home." He stood there for a second longer than was probably graceful. Then he nodded, set the mop carefully against the wall, and went to get his jacket from his locker. He didn't know what was going to happen next, and he was too tired to think about it tonight. He'd think about it on the bus home, or maybe he wouldn't think about it at all until morning when Noah climbed into his bed at 6:30 like he did every morning and demanded to know what was for breakfast. He pushed through the back door into the rain. It had softened to something gentler in the past hour. Not a drizzle exactly, but no longer an assault. He pulled his jacket collar up and started walking toward the bus stop. He didn't look back at the dealership. Behind him, through the glass and the rain, an orange engine kept running. The bus home took 40 minutes. Ethan sat in the back, jacket still damp at the shoulders, watching Meridian City slide past the window in smears of wet light. The rain had finally given up sometime around 2 in the morning and left the streets looking scoured, cleaner than they deserved, the way cities sometimes look after a hard night, all the ordinary grime temporarily washed into the gutters. He leaned his head against the cold glass and let the vibration of the engine move through his skull and tried not to think about anything specific. He mostly failed. His hands were on his knees, and he kept looking at them without meaning to. They were mechanic's hands, broad palms, scarred knuckles, a long burn mark on the inside of his right forearm from a heat gun incident when he was 23. He'd spent the last 14 months trying to forget that these hands knew how to do something. Not forget exactly. Defer. He'd been deferring, and tonight deferral had stopped being an option. And now he was sitting on a mostly empty bus at 2:45 in the morning, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not proud, not relieved. Something rawer than either of those, something that had edges to it. He got off 3 blocks from his apartment because the stop nearest his building had been broken for 2 weeks and the city hadn't fixed it. He walked through streets that were empty except for a man walking a dog who gave him a nod and a woman in scrubs coming off a night shift who didn't look up. His building was a 6-story brick structure that had been nice once, maybe 30 years ago, and was now the kind of building where things got fixed eventually and the elevator worked most of the time. He took the stairs to the 4th floor because the elevator was loud, and Mrs. Ferrara's apartment was right next to it. He knocked twice, softly. The door opened within 30 seconds, which told him she'd been awake. Mrs. Ferrara was 64, small and sturdy, with silver hair she wore in a tight braid and reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead. She'd been his neighbor since he and Claire moved in 8 years ago, and in the years since Claire died, she had become something that didn't have a clean category. Not family exactly, but something more than neighborly, something that had grown in the particular soil of shared proximity and mutual need. "Late tonight," she said, not accusatory. Just noting. "Yeah, something came up at work." He paused. "How was he?" "Ate half his dinner and all of yours when I wasn't looking. Fell asleep on the couch at 8:30. She stepped back from the door. "Come get him. He's heavy when he's sleeping." Noah was on the couch in the living room under a blanket that had cartoon trucks on it, one arm hanging off the edge in the loose, total way children sleep when they feel safe. He was 4 years and 3 months old, and he had Claire's face. Round where Ethan's was angular, open in a way that Ethan had stopped being sometime in the last 4 years. He had a small smear of something that might have been tomato sauce near his ear. Ethan stood there for a second. Then he bent down and picked him up. And Noah stirred slightly and made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and then settled back into sleep with his head on Ethan's shoulder and one fist loosely gripping the front of his jacket. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly to Mrs. Ferrara. She waved it off the way she always did. "Go sleep," she said. "You look terrible." He carried Noah across the hall and into their apartment, which was small and slightly cluttered in the specific way of a place where a single adult is trying to maintain order against the persistent creative chaos of a 4-year-old. There were toys sorted into a bin that had been unsorted and resorted so many times the bin's original color scheme was irrelevant. There was a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, a blue car, and a stick figure that Noah had identified, upon completion, as Daddy fixing it, and next to it, held by a different magnet, a school calendar with 3 dates circled in red marker. Ethan laid Noah down in his bed, removed his sneakers, pulled the blanket up. Noah's eyes opened halfway. "Dad," he said, not as a question. "Yeah, go back to sleep." "Did you fix the car?" Ethan went still. "What?" "You said there was a car that was broken." Noah's eyes were closing again. He'd said it the way children say things when they're half asleep, without strategy, without waiting to see what the answer would mean. "Did you fix it?" Ethan didn't know when he'd mentioned a car. He mentioned a lot of things to Noah without tracking what he was disclosing, because Noah was 4 and conversations with him operated on a different logic than most conversations. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I fixed it." "Good," Noah said, and was asleep before the word finished. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. The apartment was quiet. Outside the window, a car went by on the wet street, its headlights moving across the ceiling. He'd fixed it. He went to bed, but didn't sleep for a long time. The night replayed itself in pieces. Not linearly, not the way you'd retell it to someone, but in the broken way the mind reassembles experience when adrenaline is still in the system and the body is tired but the brain hasn't gotten the message. The crack in the intake runner. The moment the engine caught. Devin Park's nod across the top of the car. Marcus Webb handing him the tool without being asked. Scarlett Vale's voice saying his son's name before she knew his son's name, asking him like it mattered. "What's your son's name?" He didn't know what to do with that. He was too tired to figure it out tonight. He closed his eyes and eventually slept. And if he dreamed, he didn't remember it. Noah woke him at 6:22 by climbing onto the bed and sitting on his chest, which was Noah's standard and reliable alarm system. "Breakfast," Noah announced. "You're sitting on my lungs," Ethan said into the pillow. "Pancakes? We don't have pancakes. We could get pancakes. We have eggs. Eggs aren't pancakes." "No," Ethan agreed. "They're not." He made eggs. Noah ate them without further complaint about their pancake-adjacent status and told Ethan at length about a dream he'd had involving a dinosaur and a fire truck that were, in the dream's logic, the same vehicle. Ethan drank 2 cups of coffee and listened and said the right things at the right intervals and felt the previous night settle into a different register. Still there, still significant, but not as sharp as it had been at 3 in the morning. The kitchen was small and the morning light came in at a low angle, and Noah's voice filled the space in a way that was sometimes exhausting and was always on some level that Ethan didn't examine too closely, the thing that kept everything else moving. He dropped Noah at Mrs. Ferrara's at 7:45, which was 15 minutes early, and she looked at him again with that noting expression that said she saw more than she commented on, and he thanked her again and left. He walked to the bus stop. He didn't go home. He went back to Blackwood. He wasn't entirely sure why. His shift had ended hours ago. He had no reason to be there, but the night had left something unfinished in him that wasn't about the car. The car was done. The car was running. And he thought maybe if he went back and stood in the garage for a few minutes, the unfinished feeling would resolve itself, the way it sometimes did when you returned to the site of something and confirmed it had actually happened. He arrived at the dealership at 8:30. The morning shift was already in, the showroom lights up, and the glass front gleaming in the thin winter sunlight. He went around to the service entrance and badged in with his cleaning crew credentials, which still worked, which told him nobody had thought to change anything yet. The garage was quiet and orderly. The night crew had put the tools away, and the RS-7 sat in the center bay with a cover draped over it, waiting for transport to the exhibition venue. He stood there looking at the covered car for a moment. Then he heard footsteps. Scarlett came around the corner from the internal corridor, holding a coffee cup in one hand and a folder in the other, and she stopped short when she saw him. She'd changed clothes, charcoal pants and a dark blue blouse instead of last night's blazer, and her hair was down today rather than pulled back, which made her look slightly different, slightly less like the version of herself that ran things. She looked like she'd slept 2 hours. She probably had. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You came back," she said. "I had a shift starting at—" He stopped. That wasn't true. His shift didn't start until 11. "I don't know why I came back," he said instead. Something in her expression shifted, loosening slightly. "That's more honest." She came into the garage proper and set her coffee on the workbench and looked at the covered RS-7. "Ashford's team is picking it up at noon. The logistics coordinator called this morning. Apparently Ashford's already heard the car is running, and he's—" She paused. He used the word satisfied, which from Reginald Ashford is approximately equivalent to someone else jumping up and down. "Good," Ethan said. Scarlett turned and looked at him directly. It was a particular kind of look, the kind that is measuring something beyond the obvious. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why were you still here last night? I mean, not while you were working. I understand that. Why were you in that specific bay at 11:30 at night when we were arguing about the engine? The cleaning schedule has the garage service bay as a 6 to 9 block." He opened his mouth and then closed it, because the question was sharper than he'd expected. "I was running behind. I had a section of the storage room I hadn't finished." She waited, the way people wait when they think there's more. "And I could hear what you were describing," he said. "I wasn't trying to listen. I just—" He exhaled. "Old habit. An engine problem gets into my head and I can't turn it off." "You said you used to work on cars like this." "Where?" "Performance shop. Helix Automotive, on Caldwell. Before... He stopped. Before some things changed. She didn't push on the before. He noticed that. How long ago? She asked instead. 4 years? And after that? Temp work. Different things. He looked at his hands. The cleaning position here was supposed to be temporary. 14 months isn't very temporary. He looked up at her quickly. I pulled your file this morning, she said, without apology. After last night, I wanted to know who you were. The paperwork says you've been here 14 months. Perfect attendance. No complaints. That's it. There's nothing else in the file because we don't require anything else from the cleaning contractors. She said it evenly, without framing it as criticism, but the weight of it sat between them anyway. The blunt truth of how invisible the cleaning crew was in the administrative life of the dealership. Ethan didn't say anything. I also called a contact at Helix this morning, Scarlett continued. Her name is Pamela Torres. She was a service manager there about 5 or 6 years ago. Ethan knew the name immediately. Pam Torres had been 35 when he worked at Helix, a compact, precise woman who ran the service floor like a complex mathematical operation and had a gift for identifying which of her mechanics could be trusted with the cars that actually mattered. She'd been the one who put Ethan on his first Lamborghini. She'd been the one who started referring the exotic vehicle clients to him specifically. What did she say? He asked, and his voice came out more carefully than he intended. She said, Scarlett looked down at the folder in her hand and opened it. Ethan Cole is the most naturally talented exotic vehicle technician I've ever supervised, and I've been in this industry for 22 years. Losing him was a significant operational problem for us that we've never fully resolved. If you're asking whether you can trust him with a $3 million car, the answer is yes, without reservation. She closed the folder. That's a direct quote. The garage was quiet, except for the distant sound of voices from the showroom. Ethan stood with his hands at his sides and didn't know what to do with his face. She also mentioned your wife, Scarlett said more quietly. She didn't give me details. She said you'd left the shop under difficult personal circumstances and that she'd always hoped you'd come back to the work. A pause. I'm sorry for your loss, however long ago it was. He nodded once. The motion was tight and controlled in the way of someone keeping something in place by not moving too much. Noah seems like he has good survival instincts, Scarlett said. Asking about the car first thing this morning. Ethan blinked. How do you know he asked about the car? I don't, I'm guessing. Kids who grow up in garage households tend to. She picked up her coffee cup. My father used to bring me to the shop floor on weekends when I was small. I learned to name engine components before I learned to read. Something brief crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Not quite not. He didn't think girls were interested in cars. I had to follow him around for 2 years before he stopped being surprised when I asked questions. It was the first personal thing she'd offered, and it landed in the conversation with a different weight than the professional exchange that had preceded it. Ethan said, How old were you when you took over? 24? She said it without the performance of modesty or accomplishment. I was not ready, but he needed someone to be ready, so I decided to be. Did it work? Obviously, she said. Then, barely, for the first 2 years, barely. She set the coffee down again. The point is, I know something about doing a thing you weren't prepared for because the situation didn't give you the option of being prepared. He looked at her. He wasn't sure what she was building toward, but he could feel the shape of it from far enough away to be cautious. I'm not looking for, he started. I'm going to offer you a job, she said. I'd like to do it properly, with paperwork and a reasonable salary and benefits, so let me make the offer before you tell me what you're not looking for. He stopped. She was looking at him with the direct, uncalibrated frankness of someone who'd decided to skip the preliminary stages of a conversation. Senior Restoration Specialist. The position's been half vacant since we lost our last one to a shop in Boston 8 months ago. Marcus has been absorbing the work, but it's too much for one person, especially as we take on more complex restoration projects. She paused. Last night proved you can do the diagnostic work. Your reference from Torres confirms the rest. The salary is... She named a figure that was more than twice what he currently made. Ethan's brain took a moment to process the number and set it aside and focus on what he was actually feeling, which was a complicated mess of things he didn't have immediate language for. Relief was in there. So was something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. "I appreciate that," he said. "I need to think about it." She looked at him. "What is there to think about?" "My schedule," he said. "My son's schedule. I have a system that works. It's not a great system, but it works. And changing it there are variables I'd need to figure out." Something shifted in her expression that might have been impatience and then resolved into something more patient. "What does the current system look like?" "I drop him at my neighbor's at 7:45. My shift starts at 11, so I'm home by 8 in the morning for a few hours before a restoration specialist position is a daytime role," Scarlett said. 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. We have a childcare partnership with a facility 2 blocks from here. Full-time slots. We cover 60% of the cost as an employee benefit." She seemed to read his expression and added, "I'm not telling you this to manipulate the decision. I'm telling you because you cited logistics as a concern, and those are the logistics." Ethan looked at the covered car. He thought about the feeling last night of his hands on the engine, the way everything clicked into place, the way his mind moved through the problem at a speed that nothing else in his current life permitted. He thought about 14 months of mopping floors in a building where people who moved through it every day couldn't have told you his name. He thought about Noah saying, "Did you fix it in the half-asleep dark?" He thought about Claire, which he tried not to do in professional situations but couldn't always control. "I'll let you know by tomorrow," he said. "That's fair," Scarlett said. She picked up her folder and her coffee and moved toward the interior door. Then she stopped, without turning around, and said, "For what it's worth. The mechanic who laughed last night. Devin. He came to me this morning and said you have a better diagnostic ear than anyone he's worked with, including his instructors in Stuttgart. He's 26, and he doesn't say things like that without meaning them." A pause. "I thought you should know someone saw it." She went through the door. Ethan stood alone in the garage with the covered car and the thin winter light coming through the high windows, and the sound of the building's ordinary morning around him. He stood there for a while. Then he went home. He spent the day doing the things he usually did. Laundry, groceries, patching a section of Noah's jeans that had developed a hole at the knee, sitting with the school calendar and confirming dates. Mrs. Ferrara brought Noah home at 3:30, and he and Noah spent an hour at the kitchen table while Noah practiced writing the letter E. Ethan's suggestion, ostensibly because it was a good letter to learn and not at all because it was the first letter of his name. Noah was deeply unimpressed by the letter E and much preferred the letter S, which he said looked like a snake, which Ethan couldn't really argue with. After Noah was asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he'd forgotten to drink while it was hot and looked at the refrigerator, at Noah's drawing of the blue car and the stick figure. Daddy, fixing it. He thought about what it would mean to go back. Not just practically. The schedule, the childcare, the logistics that Scarlett had addressed with an efficiency that was slightly unsettling in how thoroughly it removed his practical objections. He thought about what it would mean in the less practical sense. The version of himself that he'd been before Claire got sick, that version had been driven by something he couldn't entirely name. Some combination of ambition and genuine love of the work and the specific pleasure of being very good at something that mattered. After she died, that version had felt too expensive to maintain, too connected to a life that no longer existed. It had felt, on the bad nights, almost disloyal to still want things when she no longer could. He knew that wasn't rational. He'd known that for a while. Knowing it and acting against it were different operations. He thought about the RS-7's engine coming back to life at 2 in the morning. He thought about the specific feeling of being useful, genuinely, technically, irreplaceably useful, in a way that the mop and the cleaning schedule never provided. He drank the cold tea. He picked up his phone and sent Scarlett a text message that said, "I'll take the job. Ethan Cole." He looked at it for a moment and then sent it. Her response came back 11 minutes later. "Good. HR will have paperwork ready Monday morning. S." He put the phone down. He looked at the ceiling. He wasn't sure what he felt exactly. Something that wasn't quite happiness and wasn't quite relief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Something cautious and uncertain and necessary. Something that had been waiting a long time to be let back in. He went to bed. In the morning, Noah climbed on his chest at 6:19, a personal record, and said with no prelude, "Are we getting a dog?" "No," Ethan said. "I want a dog." "I know." "A brown one." "Still no." "Why?" "Because I work nights and—" He stopped. "I'm changing jobs. I'll tell you about it at breakfast." Noah sat up on his chest and looked at him with an expression of 4-year-old gravity that somehow managed to be both comical and entirely sincere. "Is it a better job?" Ethan looked up at him. "Yeah," he said. "I think it might be." Noah processed this for a moment. "Can I have a dog when you have the better job?" "Absolutely not." "Why?" "Get off my chest and I'll make eggs." "I want pancakes." "I know," Ethan said. He was already sitting up. On Monday morning, Ethan arrived at Blackwood Prestige Motors at 10 to 8. He came through the front entrance for the first time. Not the service entrance with the cleaning crew badge, but the main glass door under the brushed steel Blackwood lettering, into the showroom with its gallery lighting and its roped-off machinery. The receptionist, a young woman named Jade, who had worked there for 2 years and had exchanged approximately 6 words with Ethan in all that time, looked up and said, "Can I help you?" in the polite, cautious way reserved for walk-ins whose purpose wasn't immediately clear. "I'm Ethan Cole," he said, "new restoration specialist. I'm here to see HR." She looked at him for a moment. He watched the recognition work its way across her expression, not of his face, but of his name. The story of the RS-7 had apparently circulated. "Oh," she said. "Of course. I'll let them know you're here." He stood in the showroom and looked at the cars. He'd cleaned around these cars for 14 months. He'd moved the rope barriers to reach the floor beneath them and replaced them precisely where they'd been. He'd dusted them in the early hours when the building was empty. He knew their outlines and their positioning the way you know furniture in a room you live in. As obstacles, as geography, as things to navigate around. He'd never let himself really look at them. Not look at them the way he was looking now, with the part of himself that understood what they were and what it had taken to build them. A 1972 Lamborghini Miura S in Rosso Corsa. Red. Engine access panel slightly open, mid-restoration. A 1969 Ferrari 365 GTB/4 in silver, every chrome surface catching the morning light. Farther back, a modern Aston Martin that seemed almost aggressive by comparison, like something that hadn't made its peace with being in a museum. He heard footsteps behind him and turned. It was Marcus Webb. The head of restoration services looked at him with an expression that was harder to read in the daylight and the formality of the showroom than it had been in the garage at midnight. He was wearing the same kind of dark work shirt he'd worn the other night, and he had a cup of coffee in one hand and a look on his face that was clearly working through something. They looked at each other. "HR's going to be about 10 minutes, Marcus said. "I told Jade to tell you." "Thank you." A pause. Marcus looked at the Miura. "The intake manifold on the Lamborghini needs reworking before we can move to the paint stage. The previous restorer started it wrong and I've been too stretched thin to get back to it." He took a drink of his coffee. "I thought you should know what the first week looks like." "Okay," Ethan said. Another pause, less comfortable. Marcus was clearly a man who had decided to do something and was in the process of doing it despite finding it somewhat difficult. "Last week," he started, then stopped. "The way I responded when you—" He stopped again. "It's fine," Ethan said. "It wasn't." Ethan looked at him. Marcus was staring at the Miura with the expression of a man not looking at the person he was talking to, which was its own kind of honesty. "No," Ethan said. "It wasn't, but the car's running, and I'm here now, so—" He let that sit. Marcus gave a short nod. It wasn't an apology that had been fully delivered, but it was an acknowledgement, and Ethan had long since stopped requiring things to be fully delivered. "The Miura is a good car to start on," Marcus said, back to business. "Complex enough to be interesting, but the documentation is solid." "I've worked on one before," Ethan said. "A 69, similar condition." Something passed across Marcus's face that might have been the beginning of genuine professional respect, not the obligatory kind. "Then you already know about the transaxle." "Nightmare," Ethan said. Marcus almost smiled. Not quite, but close. "HR," he said. nodding toward the interior hallway. "Then come find me." He walked away. Ethan stood alone in the showroom for a moment longer, with the gallery lights overhead and the smell of old metal and conditioning oil and money that these buildings always had, and the specific quality of silence that exists in a place before the day actually starts. He looked at the Miura. He was going to take it apart and put it back together. Something in his chest settled, the way things settle when they return to the position they were always supposed to occupy. Not without complication, not without the weight of everything that had happened between the version of himself who'd been good at this and the version of himself who was standing here now, but settled. The HR office was down the hall and to the left. He went to find it. The Miura took 3 weeks to humble him. Not because he wasn't good enough. He was, and he knew it. And that particular self-awareness wasn't arrogance so much as the functional honesty a mechanic needs to operate without second-guessing every decision. But the car had been handled badly before it arrived at Blackwood, and whoever had started the restoration had made choices that were technically defensible and practically disastrous. The automotive equivalent of building a structurally sound wall in the wrong place. Undoing someone else's confident mistakes was always harder than starting from scratch, because you had to understand what they'd been thinking before you could safely dismantle what they'd done. Ethan spent the first 3 days just assessing. He documented everything, photographed every component from multiple angles before touching it, created a written condition report for each subsystem, traced every modification back to its origin point. Marcus watched this process on the first morning with the particular attention of a man recalibrating his expectations. And on the second morning, he stopped watching and let him work, which Ethan understood as a form of acceptance. The other mechanics adjusted to him at different speeds and in different ways. Devon Park was easy. He came around to Ethan's station on the second day with a specific question about the Miura's carb setup. Not a testing question, a genuine one. And they spent 40 minutes talking through it, and after that the dynamic was established without requiring any further negotiation. Devon learned fast and didn't perform ignorance to make people comfortable, which Ethan respected. The others were more complicated. There were 5 full-time mechanics on the restoration team, and they had an existing social order built over years, and Ethan had arrived inside it at a level that made several of them uncomfortable. A man named Garrett, who had been at Blackwood for 7 years and had been informally considered the second most experienced restorer after Marcus, was cordial in the way of someone who has decided to be cordial rather than someone who feels it. He addressed Ethan as man. "Sounds good, man." "Yeah, man," with a slight emphasis that could have meant nothing and probably meant something. Ethan didn't push on it. You couldn't force a room to reconfigure itself. You could only do your work well enough and long enough that reconfiguration became inevitable. He didn't always manage equanimity about it. There was a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks in, when he overheard Garrett in the break room telling a story about a customer consultation. A story that was genuinely funny and that Ethan would have laughed at if he'd been included in the room. And the way the laughter stopped when Ethan walked in was so precise and specific that he went back out again on the pretext of having forgotten something, stood in the hallway for 30 seconds, then went back to the Miura and worked with slightly more force than the car required for another hour. He didn't mention it. There was nothing to mention, but it sat in him. The childcare arrangement had taken 2 weeks to fully stabilize. The facility was a 4-minute walk from Blackwood. Meridian Early Learning, a clean, loud building full of primary colors and noise and children moving with the specific, purposeful randomness of people who haven't yet learned to contain themselves. Noah had handled the transition with the adaptability of a child who'd been adapting to new arrangements since before he could properly remember the old ones, which was both a relief and, on the days when Ethan thought about it too directly, something that sat in his chest with weight. The first day Noah had walked in, scanned the room for approximately 4 seconds, identified a boy his age playing with a large plastic excavator, walked over and said, "That's mine now," which was, technically, not a great opening. But the other boy, whose name turned out to be Marcus too, which created a comic confusion Ethan dealt with by deciding not to think about it, had apparently found this approach charming rather than offensive, and by pickup time they were inseparable in the chaotic, total way of 4-year-olds who have decided someone is their friend. Ethan had stood in the doorway watching Noah's back as he played and felt something he'd been careful not to count on, something that felt cautiously and tentatively like normal. He and Mrs. Ferrara adjusted their arrangement. He dropped Noah at 7:30 now, rather than 7:45, which gave him time to walk to work rather than taking the bus, which he preferred. She had her mornings back. He brought her groceries on Fridays, which she accepted without ceremony, and twice she'd had dinner ready when he picked Noah up, which she claimed was purely incidental and which he understood was not. The work at Blackwood accumulated its own rhythm. He was in the garage by 8:05 every morning, and he worked with the focused, unhurried precision that good restoration demanded. You couldn't rush this work without punishing the car, and the car always told you about it later. He ate lunch at his station most days, reading documentation or working through a problem in his head, and he left at 5 or 5:15, and he walked to get Noah, and they went home. It was in the structure of its days, a life that resembled a normal one. Scarlett came through the service garage 3 or 4 times a week. Sometimes she had a purpose, a client question, a delivery timeline she needed to confirm, a conversation with Marcus about a contract. Sometimes she seemed to come because the garage was where things happened, where the business's actual substance existed rather than the front-room performance of wealth and taste. She and Ethan exchanged words most days. Brief, usually practical. He'd give her a status update on whatever he was working on. She'd note it and ask 1 or 2 specific questions and then move on. She asked good questions, not just polite ones. She asked the way someone does when they genuinely want to understand what they're being told, and she remembered what she was told, which Ethan noticed because it was not universal among people in her position. He didn't know what to make of her exactly. She was his employer, which established a clear enough structural relationship. But she was also, undeniably, something more dimensional than the category of employer typically allowed for. She was sharp and often direct to the point of bluntness, and she had the impatience of someone whose mind moved faster than most conversations, and she had what Ethan could only describe as an inconsistency. The way she'd look at something that mattered to people and register it, really register it, in a way that seemed to surprise her, as though genuine feeling was a weather event rather than a standard operating mode. He thought about that morning in the garage, "What's your son's name?" and didn't think about it further. About 3 weeks into his new position, a car arrived that changed the temperature in the shop. It came on a flatbed on a Tuesday morning, a 1965 Shelby Cobra 427 in original red and white racing livery, owned by a man named Thomas Vance, who was, Scarlett explained in a brief email forwarded to the restoration team, an art collector who had recently become interested in automotive provenance. The car had been in Vance's family for 40 years. His father had bought it new. It had been driven, stored, partially restored once in the 90s in a way that Vance was now unhappy with, stored again, and it had accumulated the complicated history of objects that are simultaneously treasured and neglected. Vance had contacted 6 restoration specialists before Blackwood. He had a budget that had several zeros at the end of it, and requirements that were correspondingly complex. He wanted the car restored to a condition that was accurate to its 1965 racing specification, but drivable, which was a tension that experienced restorers knew well, because accurate and drivable were not always compatible goals. And he wanted to be involved, which was the part of the project description that made Marcus's expression go carefully neutral when he read it. Involved clients were not inherently a problem. Involved clients who had specific emotional investments in specific outcomes and the money to be inflexible about them, those were the ones that required management. "I'm assigning you as lead on this," Scarlett said to Ethan. It was a Thursday. He'd been in the position exactly 23 days. "I know that's fast." "Marcus has more hours on American Muscle than I do," Ethan said. "Marcus is already primary on the Ashford Commission and the Bentley project, and he's going to be 100% stretched through the end of the quarter." She looked at him directly. "You've worked on Cobras?" 2. Both earlier models, both full restorations. The 47 has some different... Can you do it? He paused for a half second. "Yes." "Then your lead." She put a folder on the workbench beside him. "Vance is coming in Friday to do a walkthrough. She seemed to choose her next word with care. "Particular." "Okay." "He's going to want to talk about his father." Ethan looked at her. "Every time the car comes up, the father comes up," she said. "I talked to 2 of the previous restoration shops. It's not a manipulation. It's just the car is the father, for him. You need to understand that before you're standing in front of him nodding about intake specifications." Ethan looked at the folder. "I understand that," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and something passed through her expression that was personal and then wasn't. "I thought you might," she said, and picked up her own files and left. Thomas Vance arrived on Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock, 45 minutes later than scheduled, in a car that suggested the time wasn't intentional. He was 57, well-dressed in the unstudied way of men who have worn good clothes long enough to forget about them, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been through something and decided not to pretend otherwise. He walked into the service bay and saw the Cobra on the lift and stopped moving for about 4 seconds, which was long enough for Ethan, standing 15 feet away, to understand what Scarlett had meant. "Mr. Vance," Ethan said, "I'm Ethan Cole. I'll be leading the restoration." Vance crossed the space and shook his hand with a firm, preoccupied grip, his eyes still on the car. "She's in worse shape than I thought," he said. Not accusatory, just a man adjusting his mental picture. "The 90s restoration covered some structural issues without properly addressing them," Ethan said. "The floor pan repair was done with the wrong gauge steel, and there are stress cracks in the frame rails that suggest it wasn't a static storage issue. Someone drove it hard somewhere along the line. Recently enough that the cracks are clean." "My cousin," Vance said. A pause. 15 years ago. Borrowed it. I didn't know until—" He stopped. "The damage is repairable," Ethan said. He let the cousin's situation stay where it was. "It'll add time to the project, but the structure is sound enough that we're not rebuilding from scratch. The engine is actually in better shape than I'd expect. Whoever stored it the last time knew what they were doing with the oil system." Vance finally pulled his eyes off the car and looked at Ethan. He had the assessing quality of a man who bought and sold objects for a living and had learned to read provenance in everything. "You're younger than I expected. I get that sometimes. They said you were new here." 3 weeks, Ethan said. "I've been doing this work for about 10 years. Vance seemed to run some mental calculation. "What happened in between?" It was a direct question and not entirely appropriate, but Ethan recognized it for what it was. Not nosiness, but the instinct of a collector who understood that gaps in a timeline meant something. "Personal circumstances," Ethan said. "Family. I'm back now." Vance looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at the car. "My father bought this in February of 1965, he said. "He drove it from the dealership in Los Angeles to our house in Phoenix, 14 hours. My mother was furious. She was 8 months pregnant, and he'd promised to be home in 2 days, and it took him 4. A pause. "He said the car needed to be driven before it was put away. He said you can't know a car from looking at it." "He was right," Ethan said. "I know." Vance reached out and touched the rear quarter panel, not with the possessive grip of ownership, but with something lighter and more careful, the way you touch something you're afraid of losing. "I want her to run exactly the way she ran in 65, not restored to like new, restored to what she was." That's a harder specification. "I know. I'll need documentation on the original engine setup, factory records if you have them, period-correct photos of the car in competition context if we can find them. The more I know about what she was, the better I can get her back to it." Vance looked at him. "You sound like you actually want to do this." "I do," Ethan said, simply, without performance. Something shifted in Vance's posture, not dramatically, but the way a room shifts when a window opens in it. "I have documentation," he said. "A lot of it. My father kept everything. I'll send it over." They talked for another 40 minutes. Technical specifics, timeline, the question of the incorrect floor pan steel, and whether period-correct gauge was available from any of the specialty suppliers Ethan worked with. Vance asked good questions. He listened when Ethan answered. At 4 o'clock, when the conversation wound down, he shook Ethan's hand again and said, "I'll be direct with you. I've had 3 bad experiences with restoration shops that knew a lot about cars and not much about why people keep them." Ethan waited. "I think you might be different," Vance said. "I hope you are." He looked at the car one more time. "Take care of her." After he left, Marcus appeared from the direction of the second bay with a coffee cup and an expression that suggested he'd been within earshot for at least part of the conversation. He leaned against the workbench and looked at Ethan. "He asked for you specifically," Marcus said. "I know. He called Scarlett this morning and asked who was leading the Cobra project, and when she said you were, he said, okay." A pause. "He's turned down 4 restoration shops in the past year. He walked out of one in the middle of the consultation. Ethan picked up the folder on the Cobra and flipped it open. He just wants someone to treat the car like it matters. It's worth about $800,000, Marcus said. That's not why it matters to him. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "No," he said. "I don't suppose it is." He went back to his own station. The Cobra project established something in the shop's social landscape that simple seniority and demonstrated skill hadn't quite managed. Not because it was prestigious, though it was, but because of the way Ethan worked it. He was at his station by 7:40 some mornings, before anyone else arrived, when the shop was still and cold, and the only sounds were the building's infrastructure. He worked in that particular silence that intense concentration produces. And when people came in and found him already at it, already deep in some component's disassembled state, it registered without requiring comment. Garrett's wariness didn't disappear, but it became less pointed. He started asking Ethan questions about specific problems, casually, positioned as theoretical, the way proud people ask for help, and Ethan answered them straight, without making him feel the ask. After 2 weeks of this, the man dropped out of Garrett's vocabulary, and he started using Ethan's name instead, and that was enough. The nights were the harder part. Not the nights at work, those were past, but the nights at home, after Noah was asleep, had a quality that nothing about the improved days had entirely resolved. Ethan sat at the kitchen table most evenings with something to eat and something to read, and he was better now, objectively better. More present, more functional, more financially stable than he'd been in 4 years. And he knew that. He knew it the way you know things when you can list the evidence. But knowledge and feeling operated on different clocks, and on the nights when the apartment was very quiet, and he was tired enough that his defenses were lower than usual, the absence that had been in the apartment since Claire died was just as present and just as complete as it had ever been. He had a therapist, Dr. Renata Cho, who he saw twice a month on Tuesday evenings when Mrs. Ferrara took Noah. He'd started seeing her a year after Claire died, initially because a grief counselor at the hospital had pushed him to, and then because the sessions turned out to be useful in the specific, unglamorous way that things are useful when they help you function rather than when they make you feel dramatically transformed. Dr. Cho was 50, practical, occasionally funny, and had a gift for asking the one question that clarified what he'd spent the previous half hour obscuring. In their session the 3rd week of November, she asked him, "What changed when you took the job?" He thought about it. "I know what I'm doing again," he said. "That's the competence piece," she said. "What else?" "People see me," he said, and was slightly surprised by his own answer. "Not," he worked through it, "not the way I need to be seen or anything, just I exist in the room. I take up space in a way that registers." She nodded in the way she nodded when he was getting close to something. "And before?" "Before I was," he paused, "part of the furniture, literally, kind of. I was the furniture that moved the other furniture. And that was what you needed at the time." "Yes." "Is it still what you need?" "No." She made a note. "How is Noah processing the changes?" "He asked me last week if we could get a dog. I said no." "He asked if we could get a smaller dog. I said no. He asked if we could get a dog-shaped thing that isn't a dog. I'm not sure what that means." Dr. Cho smiled. "He sounds like he's doing well." "Yeah," Ethan said. "He is." He paused. "I don't know how to take credit for that without feeling like I'm overstating my contribution. He's resilient. He was born resilient. He learned it somewhere." Ethan looked at the window. "Claire was resilient," he said. "Maybe he gets it from her." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe he has 2 resilient parents, and he needed both of those things in his DNA to get through what he's gotten through." He didn't answer that, but he thought about it on the walk home, which was cold now in the way Meridian City got cold in November. Not brutal, but insistent, the kind of cold that presses against you to remind you it's there. He thought about it in the way he thought about things Dr. Cho surfaced, not resolving them, just turning them over, holding them to the light. He was half a block from the building when his phone rang. It was Scarlett, which was unusual. She communicated mostly through email and in person, and a call at 7:45 at night was outside the established pattern. He answered. "Are you home?" she asked. "Almost. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." A pause, and in the pause he could hear what sounded like a restaurant, the low murmur of a room full of people. I was at dinner with the Vance account. Thomas brought his business partner for some reason I'm still unclear on, and it ran long, and I'm standing outside waiting for my car, and I needed to tell someone that Thomas Vance said your name 3 times during dinner in the context of the phrase "I trust him," and I wasn't sure it could wait until Monday. Ethan stood on the sidewalk in the cold. "Okay," he said. "That's it? Okay? I mean, that's good. I'm glad." "He compared you to his father," Scarlett said, "which I've been trying to get Thomas Vance's business for 2 years, and in 40 minutes of conversation you made him feel like you and his father are cut from the same cloth, and all you have to say is okay. What do you want me to say?" A pause. "I don't know," she said, and she sounded slightly less composed than usual, which might have been the restaurant wine, or might have been the cold, or might have been genuine. "I wanted to tell someone. My dinner companions were not going to appreciate it in the right way." "Appreciate what?" "That it's not—" She stopped and started again. "Most people in this industry restore cars because they love cars. Which is fine, that's the job. But it's something else to do it the way you do. To actually—" Another stop. "You looked at that man, and you understood what the car meant to him before he told you what it meant to him. That's not a mechanical skill. I don't know what that is." Ethan stood in the cold and thought about that. "I know what it's like to need something to still be what it was," he said quietly. "That's all." Silence on the line, not an uncomfortable one. "Go home," Scarlett said finally. "It's cold." "How do you know it's cold where I am?" "It's cold everywhere tonight. Go home, Ethan." He noticed she'd used his name, not his last name. She'd been using his last name in professional contexts, which he'd noticed and filed without commenting on. "Good night," he said. "Good night." He stood on the sidewalk for another moment after she hung up, in the cold that was everywhere tonight, and looked at the orange glow of the city reflecting off the low winter clouds, and let himself feel, briefly and without analyzing it, that something was going better than he'd allowed himself to expect. Then he put his phone in his pocket and went inside. Noah had left a dinosaur on his pillow. Not a stuffed dinosaur, a plastic one, the kind that cost $4 at a museum gift shop and had an improbably aggressive expression. Noah had, over the past several months, developed a habit of leaving objects on Ethan's pillow that he considered important. Previous deposits had included a blue crayon, a half-eaten cracker, 3 acorns, and a small rock that Noah had identified as special, without further elaboration. The dinosaur was T-Rex, orange and fierce and slightly chipped from having been dropped on the bathroom tile. Ethan picked it up and set it on the nightstand. He thought about what Scarlett had said. "I don't know what that is," about the thing beyond mechanical skill. He thought about his father's garage on Garfield Avenue, about the Saturday mornings that had felt ordinary at the time and enormous in retrospect. He thought about his father explaining, while changing the oil on a customer's 20-year-old Civic, that every car somebody brings you carries the history of everyone who's driven it, their emergencies and their ordinary commutes and their cross-country moves and the drives they took when something was wrong and they needed to be moving. And your job is to put the car back in condition to carry more of that history, which means you're not just working on the machine, you're working on everything the machine has carried. He'd been 14. He hadn't thought about it in years. He lay down and looked at the ceiling. In the next room, Noah slept with total commitment, the way he did everything. The apartment was quiet. Somewhere below, a car passed on the wet street, and Ethan listened to the sound of its engine without thinking about it, automatically, the way he always had, the way he always would, and heard it running clean, well-maintained, nothing wrong. He closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, sleep came before he could think of a reason to stay awake. December arrived the way it always did in Meridian City. Not dramatically, not with a single cold front that announced itself and committed, but gradually and then all at once, the temperature dropping 5 degrees one week and another 7 the next. Until one morning you walked outside and realized the season had changed while you were busy with other things. Ethan noticed it on the walk to pick up Noah. The week before Thanksgiving had collapsed into the week after it, the city's decorations going up overnight as though someone had flipped a switch. Noah had stopped dead on the sidewalk in front of a lit store window and stood there with his mouth open, looking at the lights with an expression of total, uncomplicated wonder that made Ethan stop too, not to look at the lights, but to look at his son's face, which was doing something that 4-year-old faces do in a way that older faces forget how to. "Dad," Noah said, without looking away from the window. "Yeah. Do you think those lights hurt?" Ethan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No. I think they like it." Noah seemed satisfied with this. They walked home. The Cobra was deep into its second month. Vance had sent 3 boxes of documentation, factory build sheets, period photographs, correspondence between his father and the original dealership about the racing specification, a handwritten log of the car's first 3 years that his father had kept in a green notebook, recording every mile and every modification in the careful handwriting of someone who understood they were preserving something. Ethan had read the notebook twice. The second time, he'd read it more slowly. The documentation changed the work in ways that were difficult to explain to people who didn't do this. It wasn't just accuracy, though accuracy mattered, and the period photographs had already identified 2 details the 90s restoration had gotten wrong that Ethan was quietly correcting. It was more that the car stopped being an object and became a record of someone's life. The father's 1965 entries describing the first cross-country drive, the careful notation of a mechanical issue at a race in Tucson in 1967, and how he'd fixed it roadside with improvised parts, the entry in 1971 that said simply, "Gave her to Tommy today. He's 7, too young to understand, but he will." And working on a record required a different quality of attention than working on an object. Marcus had looked over his shoulder at the notebook once and not said anything for a long time. Then, "He's trusting you with a lot." "I know," Ethan said. "Don't break it." "I won't." It wasn't a warning. It was the closest Marcus had come to saying something like, "I'm glad you're here," which was a thing Marcus Webb was constitutionally incapable of saying directly. Ethan filed it in the category of things understood rather than stated and moved on. The shop's rhythm in December had a specific quality, a compressed energy, a sense of timelines converging. 3 major projects were in varying stages of completion. There were 2 new commissions starting in January that required prep work now, and the Ashford exhibition had generated enough visibility that the inquiry calls coming into Scarlett's office had roughly doubled since October. She had hired an additional front-of-house coordinator and was in conversations about expanding the service bay, which would require either relocating or restructuring the back half of the building, which was a project that was going to be complicated and expensive, and that she was pursuing with the focused inevitability of someone who had already decided it was happening. Ethan knew this because she told him, not in formal briefings, not the way she told Marcus in the context of operational planning. She told him in the incidental way of conversations that happened because they happened to be in the same space at the same time, and she thought out loud when her mind was working on something. He noticed the difference but didn't comment on it. She'd started stopping by his station in the last hour of the workday, a habit that had developed without either of them naming it. It wasn't daily, maybe 3 times a week. She'd come in with her end-of-day files or her phone and stand at the edge of his workspace and they'd talk. Sometimes it was about the car he was working on. Sometimes it was operational, a question about supplier timelines, a gauge of how the new commission's complexity would affect his schedule. Sometimes it was harder to categorize than that. On a Wednesday in the second week of December, she came in at 4:30 and leaned against the workbench and looked at the Cobra's disassembled dashboard components laid out on the cloth-covered table and said, "My father called today." Ethan was working on the steering column. He looked up briefly. "How is he?" "Opinionated." She set her phone face down on the workbench. "He heard about the expansion plans. He has thoughts." "I'd imagine." He built this business from 11 employees in a building half this size, so his thoughts carry a particular authority that he deploys without much restraint. She paused. "He said I was overextending. Is he right?" She was quiet for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. "He might be," she said. "He's often right about the structural things. He's less right about... He doesn't always account for the fact that holding still is also a kind of risk." Ethan set the steering column component down and gave her more of his attention. She was looking at the Cobra's dashboard pieces with the focused, slightly distant expression she had when she was working through something she hadn't finished thinking about. He doesn't think I should have hired you, she said. He went still. Okay, it's not personal. He didn't know who you were when he said it. He said promoting someone internally from a cleaning position without a formal recruitment process was a liability, that it created precedent and resentment, and she stopped. I'm telling you because you should know, not because it changes anything. What did you say to him? I said he didn't have information I had, and that the decision was mine. She looked at him then. He'll come around. He came to the shop once in October when he was in the city, and he saw the work you were doing on the Miura. He didn't say anything at the time, but he looked at it for about 5 minutes, which from my father is approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Ethan almost smiled. He's not wrong about all of it, she said. The expansion is aggressive, I know that. She picked her phone back up. But some things you do because you can see what they'll become, not what they are right now. My father bought a building full of secondhand equipment and 2 mechanics who were loyal to him personally, not to any particular vision, and he turned it into this because he could see the version of it that didn't exist yet. Vam assese. She paused. That's the thing he taught me. He just doesn't always like it when I use it. She left at 5:15. Ethan stayed another 30 minutes. Not because the work required it, but because the shop was quiet in the evenings, and quiet was useful. He picked Noah up at 6, which ran 30 minutes late because Marcus the child had lost a shoe and the recovery operation had required Noah's full forensic attention. They walked home in the dark, Noah's hand in his, Noah delivering a continuous and detailed account of an incident involving a caterpillar that had apparently entered the facility at some point during the day and caused significant excitement. And then Lily cried, Noah said. Because of the caterpillar? She said it was looking at her. Was it? Noah considered this seriously. It was looking at something, he allowed. At home, Ethan made pasta while Noah did the drawings he'd been tasked with over the week. His preschool was doing a project about families, and Noah had been assigned to draw things that were important to his family, which had resulted in a series of works featuring, in order, the apartment's window, Mrs. Ferrara, a large car that was partly red and partly orange and partly green because Noah said he hadn't decided, Ethan, and a figure that was much smaller than the others and labeled, in large letters, Noah. Why are you smaller in this one? Ethan asked, looking at the last drawing. That's not me, Noah said. That's a baby. Whose baby? Noah shrugged with complete indifference, the way children shrug when a question doesn't interest them. A baby's baby, he said, and went back to coloring. Ethan looked at the drawing for a moment, then said it with the others. The crisis, when it came, arrived from a direction nobody had been watching. It was a Friday in the 3rd week of December, cold enough that the puddles on the sidewalk outside the dealership had developed thin skins of ice by morning. Ethan was at his station at 7:50, a cup of coffee cooling at his elbow, working on the Cobra's dashboard and listening to the shop come to life around him. The sound of the other bays starting up, the overhead lights flickering on in sequence, the back door opening and closing as the morning shift arrived. At 8:15, Marcus came in fast. Not running, Marcus Webb did not run, but moving with the compressed urgency of a man who'd absorbed bad news and was redistributing it. He came directly to Ethan's station and said, without prelude, "We have a problem with the Vance car." Ethan set the dashboard component down. Vance's business partner, the one who came to dinner, Harlan Cross, apparently has a stake in the project. Not the car itself, but the timeline. He's got some kind of gallery event in February where the Cobra was supposed to be displayed. I don't know the details. I don't know why Vance didn't tell us about the event when we set the timeline, but Cross called Scarlett this morning and Marcus paused. He's requesting a delivery date of January 15th. Ethan looked at him. That's 8 weeks away. I know. The frame rail repair alone is 3 weeks. The floor pan is another 2. We haven't touched the engine rebuild or the interior, and the paint? I know, Marcus said. It can't be done in 8 weeks, not correctly, not to the specification Vance asked for. Cross isn't asking for correct. He's asking for January 15th. Marcus's voice was even, but his jaw was tight. He apparently suggested that if the timeline couldn't be accommodated, he'd be happy to take the car to another shop that could deliver it. The shop had come fully alive around them. Voices, compressors, the ordinary sounds of a morning. And Ethan sat in the middle of all of it and felt something get very cold and very clear in his chest. "Where's Scarlett?" he said. "Her office. She's been on the phone since 7. He found her 20 minutes later. He'd gone back to the Cobra first, stood in front of it for a few minutes, thinking through the problem from every angle he could find, then gone upstairs. Her office was on the second floor, glass-fronted overlooking the showroom, a functional space that was nicer than she'd made it because she'd kept the original desk from when her father ran the business and hadn't replaced most of the furniture, which gave it an unintentional quality of someone who'd been too busy to decorate. She was on the phone when he appeared in the doorway, and she held up one finger without looking at him. He waited. She finished the call and put the phone down and looked at him. She'd been in since before 7, which showed. "You heard? Marcus told me January 15th is not possible." "I know. I need you to tell Cross that." She leaned back in her chair. She had the look she got when she was holding several competing obligations in her head simultaneously and weighing them against each other. "Cross has leverage," she said. "He and Vance have been business partners for 15 years. If Cross pulls his support from the project, if we deliver that car in January, it won't be what Vance asked for. It won't be what his father's car was. It'll be something that looks like it from a distance." Ethan stopped and organized his next sentence carefully. "You told me about the RS7. You told me that the reputation was the thing, that a bad result there would have followed Blackwood through every collector conversation for years. This is the same. If Thomas Vance stands next to that car at a gallery event in February, and someone who knows Cobras looks at it closely, they'll see the shortcuts. And Vance will know. He already knows what his father's car looked like. He grew up with it. You can't fake that for someone who grew up with it." Scarlett was quiet for a moment. "What's the honest timeline?" she said. Late March. If everything goes right and we don't hit any part sourcing issues, which we will, because 2 of the components are specialty fabrications." He paused. "April to do it exactly right." She closed her eyes briefly. "Cross's gallery event is February 8th. "I know." She opened her eyes. "I'll call Vance directly," she said. "Not Cross. Vance." She picked up her pen and turned it in her fingers, a habit Ethan had noticed she had when she was locking in a decision. "I'll explain the timeline honestly. What the correct work looks like, what the shortcut version looks like, what he's actually choosing between." She looked at him. "You should be on the call." "Me? He trusts you. I said that when I put you on the project, that means when there's a hard conversation about the project, your voice carries weight." She looked at him with an expression that was asking something it hadn't quite phrased. "Can you explain it to him the way you explained it to me just now? Without the technical shorthand?" "Yes." "Then be here at 11. The call with Vance lasted 45 minutes. He answered on the second ring, which suggested he'd been expecting it. His voice had the particular quality of a man who was angry, but was controlling it because he wasn't sure yet who deserved the anger. Scarlett made the opening, explained the situation, explained that they'd been contacted by Cross, explained that she wanted to have a direct conversation with him rather than negotiate through intermediaries. She was direct without being cold, and she didn't oversell the dealership's position or undersell the problem. Ethan sat in the chair across from her desk and listened and thought, "She's good at this." Then Scarlett said, "I've got Ethan Cole here with me. He can walk you through what the timeline means technically." A pause on the line. "Put him on," Vance said. Ethan leaned forward. "Mr. Vance, the frame rail repair, the stress cracks I told you about when we first looked at the car. To do it correctly means removing and replacing a significant section of the original frame material and fabricating a replacement from period-correct steel. That work alone requires 3 weeks minimum, and it needs to cure under controlled conditions before anything else can be built on top of it. If we rush the cure, the repair looks fine until it doesn't, and when it fails, it'll fail at speed or underload, which is when it matters most." "I understand that," Vance said. "The engine rebuild is less about time and more about sourcing. 2 of the components that need replacement are not available from standard suppliers. I have a contact who fabricates to spec, but his lead time is 6 weeks. I can't compress that from my end." A pause. "If I tell you we can deliver in January, I'm telling you we can give you a car that looks like your father's car. But it won't run the way your father's car ran, and it won't last the way it should. And when someone who knows these cars gets near it, they'll know." Silence on the line. "I've been doing this work for 10 years, Ethan said. I've never deliberately cut short a restoration because a timeline changed. I'm not saying that to make myself sound principled. I'm saying it because the work is either done correctly or it isn't, and there isn't a version of this that's almost correct. Especially not for this car." He stopped. Another silence, longer this time. "Harlan doesn't understand cars," Vance said finally. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it, the controlled anger quality, replaced by something more direct. "He understands events, and he understands what things look like. He doesn't understand the difference between a car that looks right and a car that is right." "No," Ethan said. "My father would have—" Vance stopped himself, started again. "My father drove this car because it was the kind of machine that rewarded being driven properly. He used to say there was no point having something excellent if you were going to treat it ordinarily." A pause. "March, you said?" "Late March, more likely April if I'm being completely honest about it." "Will it be done correctly in April?" "Yes." "Then April," Vance said. "I'll deal with Harlan." He hung up. The office was quiet. Ethan leaned back in the chair and exhaled. Scarlett was looking at him with an expression that wasn't quite any single thing. Something compounded, something that involved more than the professional situation they'd just navigated. "His father would have what?" she said quietly. He said my father would have, and then stopped himself. What do you think he was going to say? Ethan thought about the green notebook, about the man who'd recorded every mile of the car's first 3 years. Something like, "My father would have burned the gallery down before he let someone rush the work," he said. She almost smiled. It was brief and real, not the polished version of a smile. "You're probably right." She set her pen down. "Thank you for being on that call. It needed to be said. I could have said it." "I know, but I could say it from a different place." He paused. He trusts the work, not the business, the work. She looked at him for a moment with that evaluating quality she had, the one that looked like it was cataloging something, and then she said, "Can I ask you something that's not about the car?" He waited. "When you were working the overnight shift, the 14 months, she said it carefully, like someone walking on ice they haven't tested. You were here every night. You were quiet. You were invisible. Nobody knew who you were. Did that—" She stopped and reframed. "Was that a choice you made because you needed it, or because you stopped believing you deserved better?" It was an exact question, the kind that Dr. Cho asked, the one that cut through to the thing you'd been spending the rest of the session not saying. He looked at the window behind her desk, at the gray December sky. "Both," he said. "Probably more the second one than I'd have admitted at the time." She nodded. Not with pity, he would have hated pity, with recognition. "I've done a version of that," she said. "Not the same version, but I've made myself smaller than I needed to be because it was easier than believing something better was possible." He looked at her. The admission had cost her something, he could tell. Not a lot, but something. She wasn't a person who offered personal vulnerability casually. "Who talked you out of it?" he asked. "Nobody. I talked myself out of it." A pause. "Or I'm in the process of it. I'm not sure it's a finished operation." The showroom sounds drifted up from below. A customer's voice, someone moving through the display floor. The ordinary sounds of the business continuing regardless. "The expansion," he said. "Your father thinks it's too fast." "My father built this business in 20 years. I've had 6. She looked at the window. "I'm not trying to beat his timeline. I'm trying not to lose mine." He didn't ask what she meant by that. He thought he understood. He went back downstairs to the Cobra. He stood at his station and looked at the car and thought about Thomas Vance's father recording every mile in a green notebook, and about a 7-year-old boy who was too young to understand but would, and about how the things people build, businesses, children, restored machines, any structure meant to outlast the moment, all carry the same requirement, which is that they be built on what's actually true rather than what's convenient. Because the convenient version always finds its way to the surface eventually, usually at speed, usually under load. He picked up a wrench. 3 days later, on a Monday morning, the situation Ethan had been careful not to overthink arrived without asking permission. He was at his station at 8:05 when Noah appeared in the service bay doorway. not theoretically, actually appeared in his green winter coat with the broken zipper and his small blue backpack, holding Mrs. Ferrara's hand and looking around the garage with the widest eyes Ethan had ever seen on his face, which was saying something because Noah's default eye setting was already wide. Mrs. Ferrara looked at Ethan with an expression of combined apology and necessity. The facility called 20 minutes after I dropped him, some kind of heating issue. They're closed for the day. I tried to call you. Ethan's phone was on the workbench, face down, on silent because he was always on silent in the shop. He looked at it. 3 missed calls. I didn't know what else to... It's fine, Ethan said. Thank you for bringing him. Mrs. Ferrara left. Noah stood in the doorway of the service bay and looked at the cars. He looked at the Cobra on the lift. He looked at the Miura in the far bay, whose restoration was now complete and awaiting final inspection. He looked at the rows of tools and the overhead lights and the concrete floor and the smell of the place, which was oil and metal and something else that Ethan had stopped noticing years ago. Dad? Noah said. Yeah. These are your cars. I work on them. They belong to other people. Noah processed this. But you fix them. Yes. He walked forward into the garage with the careful, reverent slowness of someone entering a space they understand matters. He stopped in front of the Cobra and looked up at it. It was on the lift, so the car was at approximately Noah's eye level, and his expression was the same one he'd had in front of the store window looking at the lights. That one's special, he said. It wasn't a question. Ethan crouched down beside him. Yeah, he said, it belonged to somebody's father, a long time ago. Like yours? Like mine. Noah reached out slowly, looked at Ethan first, and Ethan nodded, and Noah put one small hand very gently on the Cobra's door panel. He left it there for a moment. Then he pulled it back and looked at his palm like he was checking something. It's okay, Noah said quietly, to the car, not to Ethan. Ethan looked at his son. He didn't know what it's okay was supposed to mean to a 1965 Shelby Cobra, or if it meant anything, or if Noah even entirely knew what he was saying. He thought about Vance's father in the green notebook, and about his own father on Garfield Avenue, and about the ways things pass from one person to the next through hands and attention and care, and he thought the word that had been sitting in his chest since he'd accepted this job and maybe longer than that, the word that was not happiness exactly, but lived next to it, and it was home. Devin appeared from the second bay with a coffee cup and stopped when he saw Noah. Whose kid? He said. Mine, Ethan said. Devin looked at Noah, who looked back at him with frank assessment. Cool car, Noah said, nodding toward the Cobra. Devin looked at the Cobra, looked back at Noah. Yeah, he said. Your dad's making it cooler. Noah looked at Ethan with an expression that mixed pride and skepticism in the way that only children can manage. Is that true? That's the goal, Ethan said. Noah seemed to accept this. He set his backpack down next to the workbench and unzipped it and began removing items with serious intent. A small notebook, 3 crayons, and the orange T-Rex dinosaur, which he positioned on the edge of the workbench facing the Cobra. Ethan watched him. He looked up and found Scarlett in the doorway between the interior corridor and the garage. She was standing there with a coffee in her hand and a look on her face that he couldn't fully read from across the garage. Something open in it, something that was looking at Noah and then at Ethan and then back at Noah with an expression that seemed to be taking something in. She didn't say anything. She raised her coffee cup slightly, a small acknowledgement. Then she turned and went back through the door. Ethan turned back to Noah, who had opened his notebook to a blank page and was looking at the Cobra with the expression of someone preparing to document something important. What are you drawing? Ethan said. The car, Noah said. So I remember it. Ethan looked at his son. He thought about Vance's father and the green notebook, and he thought, of course. Okay, he said. I'll be right here. He picked up the wrench. He went back to work. January moved through Meridian City the way January always did, with a gray pressing insistence that made February feel like a rumor nobody quite believed in yet. The days were short and the mornings were dark, and the shop's overhead lights came on before the sun did, which meant that for most of the winter, Ethan arrived at work in the dark and left in what passed for light, and the transition between them happened somewhere in the middle of the day while he wasn't paying attention. He didn't mind it. He'd never minded winter the way some people did. There was something honest about a season that didn't pretend to be comfortable. The Cobra consumed him in the best possible way through January and into February. The frame rail repair had gone precisely as long as he'd told Vance it would. 3 weeks of careful work, the replacement section fabricated to spec, the welds dressed, and the whole assembly inspected 3 times before he'd let the cure process begin. The specialty components from his fabrication contact arrived in the 5th week, 2 days later than expected, which had required a brief recalibration of the schedule that Ethan had sent to Scarlett in an email without framing it as a crisis, because it wasn't one. She'd written back, noted. Still April? He'd written, still April. She'd written, good. The engine rebuild took 4 weeks and was, in Ethan's private assessment, the finest work he'd done since Helix, possibly the finest work he'd done, period. Not because of the difficulty, though it was difficult, but because of the standard he was holding it to. He had Vance's father's documentation. He had the period photographs. He had the handwritten log that described how the car had sounded in 1965 when it was new. A description that was not technical, but was exact in the way that people who love machines find language for what instruments cannot measure. She breathes deep on the highway. He'd written in April of that year, like she's been waiting for it. Ethan was going to make it breathe deep again. He was going to make it sound the way a 7-year-old boy had heard it sound before he was old enough to understand what he was hearing, but old enough that it went into him and stayed. That was the job. Marcus came by the engine station one morning in early February when Ethan had the rebuilt Flat 8 assembled and was running the first preliminary cycle, and he stood there for 4 minutes listening to it idle. He didn't say anything. When the cycle ended, he looked at Ethan and gave one slow nod, the deliberate, considered kind, and went back to his own station. It was the most expressive Ethan had ever seen him, and he understood it completely. The shop itself had changed shape around him so gradually that he hadn't noticed the extent of it until one afternoon in late January when he looked up from the Cobra and saw Garrett on the other side of the bay explaining something to a new junior mechanic named Priya, who had been hired in the new year, and Garrett was explaining it the way Ethan explained things, step by step, without impatience, making sure the understanding was there before moving to the next part. He'd picked that up from watching Ethan with Devin, Ethan realized. He hadn't been taught it. He'd absorbed it. That was how things actually changed, Ethan thought. Not through declarations or organizational initiatives, through proximity, through watching someone do a thing the way it should be done and deciding, without anyone asking you to decide, that you wanted to do it that way too. Devin had grown into something that Ethan would have called, without exaggeration, genuinely exceptional. The kid had always had the raw material, the precision, the ear, the willingness to stay with a problem until it resolved. What he'd been missing was someone who treated his questions as worth answering carefully, and over 4 months that deficit had been corrected. He was 26 years old, and he was on his way to being one of the best diagnostic mechanics in the city, and he knew it. Not with arrogance, but with the specific confidence of a person who has accurately identified what they're capable of. One morning in February, he stopped by Ethan's station before the workday properly started and said, "I got a call from a shop in New York. Specialty restoration, high-end clients. They want to talk to me about a position." Ethan looked at him. "I'm not going," Devin said. "I wanted you to know I'm not going." "You don't have to tell me that." "I know. I wanted to anyway." He paused. "I wouldn't be in the conversation with a shop like that if I hadn't spent the last 4 months working next to you. I know that." Ethan held his gaze. "You were already good when I got here." "I was technically competent," Devin said with a precision that suggested he'd thought about the distinction. "That's different." He went back to his station. Ethan stood there for a moment and thought about his father on Garfield Avenue, about the men who'd come through that shop over 30 years and learned things there that they carried forward, and about how a thing you build with your hands, or a thing you build with your attention and your standard and your willingness to answer a question carefully, extends itself into the world through other people in ways you never fully track. He thought his father would have liked Devin. He thought his father would have liked this shop, the version of it that it had become. He went back to the Cobra. The paint went on in the 3rd week of February. Ethan wasn't a painter. That was Garrett's strongest skill. The area where his 7 years at Blackwood had produced something genuinely excellent, and Ethan handed the car to him with explicit specific trust, which Garrett received with an expression that contained approximately 3 different emotions resolving into something simpler. The color was the original racing red, matched from a documented paint code from Vance's father's records, and the white accent stripes were applied by hand in the period-correct width and position. When Garrett finished the final clear coat and stepped back, he said, "Come look." Ethan came and looked. It was right. Not just correct, right. The color had a depth to it that photography couldn't capture, and the stripes sat on the body with the confidence of something that belonged there, not something applied to it. The car looked like it had always been this color, which it had, which was the point. "Good work," Ethan said. Garrett exhaled. "Yeah," he said, "it is." They stood next to each other looking at it, 2 men who'd had a difficult beginning and had arrived somewhere better without either of them being able to identify the exact moment the difficulty had resolved, and neither of them said anything about that because it didn't need saying. The interior took the last 3 weeks. Original materials sourced through a specialty supplier in California, installed with the care that a 40-year-old car's tolerances required. Nothing forced, nothing approximate. The dashboard components that Ethan had spent weeks restoring went back in, each one correct, each one fitting the way it had fit in 1965 because he'd made sure it would. On the last day of March, which was cold and clear, in a way that felt like the first actual suggestion of spring, Ethan started the Cobra and drove it out of the service bay. He drove it around the back lot, which was not a romantic setting, concrete and painted lines and the rear facade of the building, but was enough space to run through the gears and feel the engine breathe. It breathed the way he'd intended. The Flat 8 moved through its power band with a sound that was authoritative and clean and alive, a sound that meant the machine was working exactly as it was supposed to work, all its systems in agreement, nothing fighting anything else. He pulled back into the bay and sat for a moment with the engine idling. He thought about a man in 1965 driving 14 hours from Los Angeles to Phoenix because the car needed to be driven before it was put away. He thought about a 7-year-old boy who was too young to understand. He thought about the green notebook. He turned the engine off. He sat in the quiet. Then he got out of the car and called Vance. Thomas Vance arrived at Blackwood on the first Saturday of April with his daughter, who was 22 and had her father's eyes and the focused skepticism of someone who had heard a great deal about this car over the course of her life and was reserving judgment. She walked around it twice without speaking, which Ethan recognized as the behavior of someone who actually knew what they were looking at. Vance himself walked around it once and then stopped and stood very still for a moment that went on long enough that his daughter glanced at Ethan with an uncertain expression. "She's right," Vance said finally. His voice was different, lower, more private than his usual register. "She looks exactly right." "The paint code is from your father's original documentation," Ethan said. "The stripe width is from a period photograph, 1967, Tucson race." Vance looked at him. "I read the notebook," Ethan said simply. Vance was quiet for another moment. His daughter put her hand briefly on his arm. He didn't seem to notice, but his posture shifted slightly, something releasing in it. "Can I drive her?" he said. "That's what she's for," Ethan said. Vance drove for 40 minutes. He came back with an expression that Ethan didn't try to read directly because it was too private for that. He got out of the car and stood next to it and said, very quietly, "She breathes deep." Ethan nodded once. "That's what he wrote," Vance said, "in the notebook. I've read it so many times I have it memorized, and that's—" He stopped. He looked at the car. "Did you read that part?" "Yes." Vance looked at him with an expression that was asking something that went beyond the professional transaction of a restoration completed. It was asking whether Ethan had understood, not just read. "Thank you," he said. It came out with more weight than the words usually carry. "It was the right car to work on," Ethan said, and meant it exactly. After Vance left, Ethan stood in the empty service bay for a few minutes in the particular quiet of a finished project. This was always a specific feeling, not quite empty, not quite satisfied, something between the two. The absence of the problem that had been occupying your mind is its own kind of presence for a while. Scarlett came in from the corridor. She'd been in the building, It was a Saturday, which she worked because she always worked, which was something Ethan had stopped being surprised by. And she'd watched part of Vance's walk-around from the interior window without coming out. He'd seen her there. She stood next to him and looked at the empty space where the Cobra had been. He cried a little, she said, when he was looking at it the first time. I know. Did that bother you? He thought about it honestly. No, it meant it was right. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the high windows, the thin April light was doing its best. Harlan Cross called me, she said, after Vance told him the gallery event was moved to May. She paused. He was unpleasant about it. I know. You didn't tell me. There was nothing to tell. I told him the timeline was non-negotiable and that if he had further concerns about how we managed our commissions, he was welcome to take his business elsewhere. She said it without drama. He didn't call back. Ethan looked at the empty space. Vance called me last week, he said. He asked if he could recommend me personally to his collector contacts. I said yes. I know. He called me too. A small pause. He said, and I'm quoting him, "You have someone on your team who understands what these machines mean to people. That's rarer than mechanical skill. Don't let him go anywhere." Ethan was quiet. I don't intend to, Scarlett said. It was a professional statement and possibly something else, and Ethan let both versions of it exist without pulling them apart. The expansion, he said. The new bay. How is that moving? Breaking ground in June. She crossed her arms, a habitual posture. My father came to see the building plans last week. He spent 2 hours with the architect without telling me he was coming. I found out when the architect called me afterward. What did he say? To the architect or to me? Either. To the architect, apparently he had 17 structural suggestions, 4 of which were actually good. To me, she stopped. She was looking at the empty bay with an expression that was private in the way her expression sometimes got when she let her guard down by a fraction of an inch. He said he was proud of me, which he has said maybe 4 times in my life and never easily. A pause. He also said he'd like to meet you, formally, not accidentally over a set of blueprints. Ethan looked at her. Why? Because you worked here for 14 months and he walked past you a dozen times and never knew your name, and he seems to find that... She searched for the word. Corrective. Of something he believes about himself. Ethan thought about that. About a man who had built something over 30 years and taught his daughter to see what things could become, and hadn't looked closely enough at the people moving through his own building to see what they already were. I'll meet him, Ethan said. I'll set it up. She uncrossed her arms. There was something she was holding that she hadn't said yet. He'd learned to recognize the specific quality of her pauses when that was happening. Can I tell you something that isn't about business? Yes. She looked at him directly, which was always her default but had a different quality right now. Less measured, less in control of what it was revealing. That morning after the RS7, when I came back to the garage and found you there, I asked you why you'd come back and you said you didn't know, and I said that was more honest. She paused. I've thought about that moment more than I expected to. He waited. I think I came down to the garage that morning because I needed to see if you were real, she said. The night before, you were something that happened, and then it was over, and I needed to confirm it had actually happened the way I thought it had. A pause. You came back to confirm the same thing, I think. That the night was real, that what you'd done was real. He looked at her. I've spent 6 years in this building, she said, and I've been very certain about what matters here. Revenue, reputation, relationships with clients who can move markets. Those things matter. I'm not saying they don't, but they're not... She stopped and tried again. I forgot that there are people in this building. Not staff, not positions, people. And you reminded me of that on the worst night this business had seen in 2 years, while you were pushing a mop. It was the most she'd ever said directly about what had changed in her since October. Ethan looked at her for a moment. He thought about the night of the RS7, about 14 months of invisibility, about the difference between being in a room and being seen by it. He thought about what it cost her to say the things she'd just said. She was not a woman to whom admission came easily. You saw it when it mattered, he said. You could have laughed with the rest of them. You didn't. I almost did, she said quietly. But you didn't. She was quiet. That's the whole story, he said. Nobody acts perfectly. People just act better or worse in the moment that counts. You acted better. She looked at him for a moment that went on just a beat past professional, and then she looked away and said, Noah asked me yesterday if we could put a dog in the garage. He blinked. When did you talk to Noah? He was here on Tuesday when you were finishing the Cobra interior, and he came upstairs to find the bathroom, and ended up in my office asking me questions about the cars in the showroom for 20 minutes. She paused. He identified the Miura correctly by sight. He called it the low red one and said it smelled different from the other ones. Ethan looked at the ceiling. He told me his favorite car was the one his dad fixed that had a story, she said. He meant the Cobra, I think. He's been drawing it, Ethan said, since the day he came here in December. He has 12 drawings of it at various stages. He documented the restoration. He paused. Like the notebook. Scarlett went very still for a moment. He doesn't know about the notebook, she said. No. She seemed to hold that thought carefully, the way you hold something fragile. She stopped. He's a remarkable kid. He is, Ethan said, without qualification, without the hedge of modesty that he sometimes applied to things about Noah because it felt safer not to count on them too completely. Just, he is. She smiled. Not the brief, controlled version, a real one, the kind that arrived without being managed. You should take him to see the car when Vance displays it in May, she said. Vance would want that. He'd understand exactly why. I'll ask him, Ethan said. The April afternoon was doing something outside the high windows. The light had shifted, gone warmer, and the quality of it was different from the winter light that had defined the shop for the past 4 months. Spring was not a dramatic arrival in Meridian City. It was incremental, practical, the temperature moving in small increments and the light changing by degrees. And then one afternoon you noticed it was genuinely warm and had been for a few days, and you'd been too busy to register it. Ethan registered it now. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in late April, he picked Noah up from Meridian Early Learning, and they walked toward home through streets that were finally warm enough to walk slowly rather than with the compressed shoulder-up posture of winter. Noah was carrying a drawing he'd made that day. A house, large and slightly asymmetrical, with 4 figures in front of it. Too tall, too small. Who are they? Ethan asked. Noah pointed. That's you. That's me. That's Marcus. He meant Marcus the child, his friend, not Marcus Webb. And that one's a lady. Ethan looked at the 4th figure. Which lady? Noah shrugged with total indifference. A nice one, he said, and kept walking. Ethan looked at the drawing a moment longer, then looked up at the street ahead of them. He didn't say anything. On the Saturday of the Vance Gallery event, Ethan drove Noah across the city to a gallery in Meridian's Arts District that occupied a converted warehouse and that had arranged, in its main space, a collection of objects its curator called Records of Velocity. Photographs, documents, and 3 vehicles that represented, in the curator's words, the intersection of mechanical craft and human history. The Cobra sat at the center of the space under lighting that made the red deepen and the chrome sing. Around it, mounted at eye level, were selections from Vance's father's documentation, pages from the green notebook, enlarged and framed, the handwriting clear and precise and entirely legible. Noah walked up to the car and stood in front of it with his hands in his pockets, which was a posture he'd picked up recently, and that made him look, improbably, about 30 years older than he was. He looked at it for a long time. Vance found them there. He came across the gallery floor with his daughter, and he crouched down in front of Noah, with the natural ease of a man who'd raised children and knew how to meet them where they were. You're Noah, Vance said. Noah looked at him. You're the man whose dad had the car. That's right, Vance said. Did your dad tell you about it? Some, Noah said. He looked at the car. He fixed it for a long time. He did, very carefully. Vance paused. Your father is the best at what he does. Do you know that? Noah looked at Ethan, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular expression of a child receiving confirmation of something they already believed and needed to hear, said out loud by someone besides themselves. Yeah, he said. I know. Vance stood. He looked at Ethan over Noah's head with an expression that said several things at once. The notebook pages, he said. The ones they framed. There's one in particular, third from the right on the east wall. I wanted you to see it. Ethan walked across the gallery floor to the east wall. Noah followed. The notebook page was from October 1968. Vance's father's handwriting, careful and familiar now, from all the hours Ethan had spent reading it. Thinking today about what it means to keep something right, it said. Not just mechanically, though that matters and you have to know what you're doing, but right in the way that means it still is what it was. Most things don't survive being handed from one person to the next. They get changed by the handling. The trick is knowing what the thing actually is, underneath the surface, underneath what it looks like, and protecting that part. That's the work. The rest is just turning wrenches. Ethan read it twice. Noah was reading it too, slowly, his lips moving slightly over the longer words. What does it say? Noah asked. Ethan thought about how to translate it into 4-year-old terms and decided not to translate it. It says the work matters, he said, and that the important part of something isn't always the part you can see. Noah considered this. Like how the engine is inside? Exactly like that. Noah nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to look at the other notebook pages with the methodical attention he'd been applying to the car's documentation since December. Ethan stood in front of the framed notebook page and thought about the night of the RS-7, which felt like a long time ago and like last week simultaneously. He thought about the cleaning coveralls and the mop and the particular quality of invisibility that had been simultaneously his shelter and his cage for 14 months. He thought about Scarlett's voice saying, "What's your son's name?" before she knew his son's name. He thought about Marcus handing him the wrench without being asked. He thought about the specific distance between where a person is and where they can be, and how that distance is never as fixed as it feels from the inside of it. The person standing in the corner of a garage at midnight with a mop was the same person who'd restored this car. Not a different person, not a transformed person. The same one. The skill had always been there. The capacity had always been there. What it had needed was a room that was willing to look up. That was the thing nobody told you about being invisible. It wasn't that the room couldn't see you, it was that the room had decided not to, and those are genuinely different problems with different solutions. The first one is about light. The second one is about will. He thought about Noah's drawing, the house with the 4 figures, the nice lady, and he thought about what was possible now in a way that he hadn't let himself think about for a long time, because the thinking hurt too much. He was 32 years old. He was good at something that mattered to people, and he had a place to do it, and a son who documented things in notebooks, and a neighbor who left dinner on the table, and a therapist who asked the right questions, and a world that was, cautiously and incrementally, making room for him to exist in it at full size. It was not a perfect life. It had the specific texture of actual lives, incomplete and complicated and marked by losses that didn't disappear because other things improved. Claire was still gone, and that was not a fact that coexisted peacefully with anything. It simply coexisted. The gap she'd left was permanent, not healing in the way wounds heal, but something he was learning to carry more accurately. The way you learn to walk with a weight, by adjusting your gait, rather than pretending the weight isn't there. But the rest of it was real and earned and his. Noah appeared at his elbow with a gallery brochure he'd acquired from somewhere and was now using as a drawing surface, sketching the cobra from the angle they were standing at. He'd brought a pencil in his coat pocket. Ethan had learned to stop being surprised by what Noah's pockets contained. "Dad," Noah said, sketching. "Yeah. When I grow up, I want to fix cars." Ethan looked at him. "Yeah? Or dinosaurs," Noah said, "if they come back." "I'll support either one," Ethan said. Noah looked up from his drawing with the direct, uncomplicated seriousness of a child asking a real question. "Will you teach me? The car part?" Ethan looked at his son's face, Claire's round face, Claire's open expression, Ethan's steady eyes, and felt the thing that lived next to happiness but was more durable than happiness because it didn't depend on everything being all right. It depended only on being present for the thing in front of you. "Yeah," he said. "I'll teach you." Noah went back to drawing. Across the gallery, Vance was talking to a group of collectors near the Cobra, his hand resting on the roof with the ease of someone who had made peace with something they'd been afraid to touch. His daughter was beside him, and she was smiling at something he'd said, and the light was catching the car's red in a way that made it look almost warm, like something with a temperature. Ethan stood next to his son in a gallery in Meridian City on an April afternoon and watched a room full of people look at a thing he'd made right. And he thought about his father's shop on Garfield Avenue, and about the cars that passed through it over 30 years, and everyone who drove them, and all the ordinary and extraordinary things those people carried in those machines, back and forth across lives that the cars outlasted. The work was the record. That was what Vance's father had understood, writing in the green notebook in October of 1968. The work was the record of everyone who'd done it and everyone it had been done for. And if you did it correctly, not quickly, not cheaply, not to impress anyone, but correctly, to the actual standard of what the thing deserved, then you were adding yourself to a chain of attention that stretched backward into other people's lives and forward into lives you'd never see. That was worth getting up for. That was worth coming back for. Noah finished his drawing and held it up for Ethan's inspection. It was the Cobra, recognizable despite the 4-year-old rendering, with the low nose and the long flanks and the racing stripes, and in front of it a stick figure with large hands. "Is that me?" Ethan asked. "No," Noah said. "That's the car's person." "The car's person?" "Every car has a person," Noah said patiently. "That's the person this one belongs to." Ethan looked at the drawing. "It looks a little like me," he said. Noah examined it critically. "Maybe," he allowed. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, next to the pencil, and reached up and took Ethan's hand with the total, unconsidered trust of a child who has never had reason to doubt the hand will be there. They stayed until the gallery began to empty. Then they walked out into the April evening together, and the city was warm for the first time all year, and it was enough. It was exactly enough.